In the final, desperate months of 1945, the Japanese High Command still imagined war in familiar terms. They thought in divisions and fleets, artillery lines and island strongholds. On charts in Tokyo, generals and admirals moved pins and flags, still believing that raw courage and traditional strategy might somehow force better peace terms. But in the space of a few days, the United States unveiled a technology that shattered every assumption those officers had about what war could be. For American viewers today, this is the story of how Japanese military leaders confronted a weapon they could not fully understand, and how that shock instantly changed their calculation on surrender, while the rest of the world, including the Soviet Union, watched in stunned silence as American science leaped ahead into an entirely new age. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was, in the eyes of Japanese planners, just one more city among many. It had military factories, a headquarters, and important transportation links, but nothing about it suggested it would become the symbol of a new kind of war. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council had met again and again, weighing the possibility of an Allied invasion against the hope of a negotiated peace. They believed they could make the war costly enough for the United States that Washington would soften its terms. They pointed to the bloody battles of Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa as evidence that Japan could still inflict serious casualties. Their mental picture of the future was one of trenches, suicide attacks, and massed defenses on the beaches of the home islands. Then, that morning, something happened to Hiroshima that no one in Tokyo had anticipated. Communications abruptly went silent, telegraph lines failed, radio contacts broke off. Messages from nearby regions reported a blinding flash, followed by a rising column of smoke. At first, these reports made no sense. Japanese air defense systems had not detected a massive bomber raid. There were no reports of hundreds of aircraft crossing their coasts, no radar evidence of the kind of attack that could erase an entire city in one blow. For officers used to thinking in terms of conventional bombing, the idea that one strike could do this was almost impossible to process. For several crucial hours, the Japanese General Staff did not know what had happened. Some speculated about an ammunition depot exploding. Others suggested a new type of incendiary raid. But the details trickling in did not fit those patterns. Witnesses described an overwhelming flash of light and heat, buildings collapsing outward in all directions, and an enormous cloud rising into the sky. There was no clear direction of attack, no wave after wave of incoming planes. It felt, to those who saw it from a distance, as if the destruction had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. By the following day, the picture had become more disturbing. The Japanese government learned that President Truman had addressed the world, publicly announcing that the United States had used an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. According to his statement, the bomb released more energy than 20,000 tons of TNT. For officers who had spent years calculating tonnage and bomb loads, that number alone was staggering. The Americans were claiming, essentially, that they had concentrated the destructive force of hundreds of bombers into a single weapon. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, reactions ranged from disbelief to alarm. Many Army officers refused at first to accept that this was truly an atomic bomb. They demanded proof. Their own scientists had explored nuclear physics and understood, at least in theory, that a fission weapon was possible. But the Japanese leadership had previously concluded that such a project would require resources and industrial capacity far beyond what their country could afford in wartime. From that perspective, if Japan could not make such a bomb, it was hard for them to imagine that the Americans had. In their minds, this sort of weapon belonged to a distant scientific future, not to the immediate battlefield. The Navy, by contrast, tended to take the American claim more seriously. Some naval officers recognized that the United States had a vast industrial base and access to uranium resources. They accepted that Washington might have achieved what Tokyo could not. Even then, many reassured themselves with another assumption, that the Americans could not possibly have many of these bombs. Perhaps one, perhaps two, they reasoned, but certainly not enough to systematically destroy all of Japan's cities. Behind this assumption lay a comforting belief that even if the technology was real, it was still rare and limited, not yet a decisive factor in the overall balance of power. To clarify the situation, the Japanese High Command organized an investigation. Specialists, including physicists and military technicians, were ordered to travel to Hiroshima to examine the damage and determine what kind of weapon had been used. What they found challenged every conventional idea of air attack. In the heart of the city, buildings were flattened in all directions, as if pushed outward from a central point in the air. Burn patterns on walls and human skin indicated intense heat and radiation, unlike anything seen in firebombing raids. In some places, shadows of people and objects were burned into stone. The destructive radius was far greater and more uniform than they expected from ordinary explosives. As reports from these investigators reached Tokyo, the mood in the general staff grew more serious. Reluctant army officers had to admit that the evidence pointed to something beyond conventional weapons. The description matched what their own scientists had outlined years earlier as the effects of an atomic detonation. A single bomb detonating high above the city had unleashed a wave of heat, blast, and radiation that destroyed or badly damaged most structures within a vast circle. For career officers who had built their lives around the idea of incremental advantage, more tanks, more planes, more artillery, this realization was a turning point. The battlefield itself had changed. Yet, even with this grim confirmation, the Supreme War Council remained divided. Some members argued that, horrible as Hiroshima was, the basic strategy could remain the same: hold out, force the Americans to invade, and inflict such losses that the United States might soften its terms. They clung to the belief that the Americans had at most a handful of atomic bombs. In their minds, it was still possible that Japan could endure a few more blows, then negotiate. The idea that the United States might be prepared to destroy city after city with these weapons had not fully sunk in. 3 days after Hiroshima, any remaining hope that the situation was manageable began to collapse. On August 9th, another atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki. At nearly the same time, the Soviet Union, which had been neutral toward Japan, launched a massive invasion of Japanese forces in Manchuria. For Japanese military leaders, this was a double blow, a strategic nightmare combined with a technological shock. On paper, their war plans had assumed that the Soviet Union could be used as an intermediary, or at least remain outside the conflict. Now, with Soviet armies advancing and American atomic bombs falling on their cities, the concept of a controlled, negotiated end to the war evaporated. Inside the Supreme War Council, sometimes called the Big Six, debate became desperate. Army hardliners argued that the country should still fight on, hoping to preserve the imperial institution and better terms by bleeding the invasion forces. Others, including some civilian leaders and more cautious officers, insisted that the combination of atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war had made further resistance suicidal. One way to understand that shift is to see how the concept of risk changed. Before Hiroshima, risk meant more casualties and more damage in a conventional sense. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, risk meant the potential annihilation of entire cities in single blows, with no effective defense. Many officers struggled to integrate nuclear weapons into their mental model of war. Air defenses, anti-aircraft guns, fighter interceptors, all the tools designed to blunt enemy raids suddenly seemed almost irrelevant. The Americans didn't need to send hundreds of bombers into a flak-filled sky. They could send one or a few aircraft, each carrying a single weapon capable of overwhelming anything Japan could put in its path. The old calculus, in which courage, sacrifice, and clever positioning might offset material inferiority, now looked fatally outdated. It was not just that the United States had more resources, it was that the United States had stepped into an entirely new technological league. For American audiences, it is easy to imagine the emotional impact this must have had in Tokyo. Picture generals who had spent their careers studying Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, officers who had grown up glorifying bayonet charges and naval battles, suddenly told that a distant enemy could, from thousands of miles away, detonate miniature suns above their cities. They had no working atomic program of their own. They had no stockpile of deterrent weapons. They had only scattered civil defense preparations designed for conventional bombs and scattered reports of people dying not just from blast and fire, but from a strange sickness that followed the flash. While Japanese officers were wrestling with this new reality, other powers were watching closely. In Moscow, Soviet leaders had their own spies and analysts parsing every bit of information coming out of Japan and the United States. They knew enough to realize that the Americans had not only succeeded in building atomic weapons, but had used them operationally against real cities. For Soviet strategists, this was both a threat and a challenge. Their own atomic program was still in development. The Americans had just demonstrated a working capability, proving beyond doubt that they were ahead in one of the most critical technologies of the 20th century. From an American point of view, this is where pride, fascination, and curiosity come together. The same country that had mobilized vast resources to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan was now showcasing a scientific achievement that literally changed how nations thought about war. Japanese military officers who had once been confident in the might of their army and navy were now forced to admit that they were facing a weapon they could not counter. Soviet planners, meanwhile, had to accelerate their own efforts just to avoid falling hopelessly behind. The United States had set the pace of the new arms race. Back in Tokyo, the psychological strain inside the leadership grew intense. Accounts of those days describe late-night meetings, heated arguments, and a sense of impending catastrophe. Even some of the staunchest militarists realized that the nation stood on the edge of total ruin. The combination of atomic devastation and Soviet invasion stripped away the last illusion that Japan could somehow maneuver itself into a better bargaining position. Each day that passed without surrender risked another city becoming a wasteland like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was in this atmosphere that Emperor Hirohito made his crucial decision. While the emperor had long been kept somewhat apart from day-to-day military planning, the gravity of the situation forced him to intervene directly. In a series of meetings, he listened to both sides, those who argued for continued resistance and those who urged surrender. The emperor was deeply affected by reports of atomic destruction. In his famous broadcast, he would later refer to a new and most cruel bomb that had the power to wipe out many innocent lives. From his perspective, the technology deployed against Japan had crossed a moral and practical line. For many officers, the emperor's decision was the final word. When he stated that the nation must endure the unendurable and accept the Allied terms, he was acknowledging that the traditional metrics of honor and sacrifice had been overtaken by a new reality. Continuing the war in a world where the United States possessed atomic weapons and the Soviet Union had joined the fight would not save the empire. It would only ensure that more cities and more civilians would be annihilated by forces the Japanese military did not understand and could not stop. To appreciate how deeply this cut, imagine a Japanese staff officer who had survived the entire war. He had seen the army advance across Asia, then retreat under overwhelming American firepower. He had watched the Navy bleed out in the Pacific, ships going down under waves of carrier-based aircraft. He had endured firebombing raids on Tokyo and other cities. Through it all, he could still tell himself that Japan was fighting in a recognizable war, using strategies and tools that had evolved over decades. Now, in a matter of days, he discovered that the enemy had opened a new chapter of history, one in which traditional defenses offered no guarantee of survival. For American viewers, there is a particular kind of fascination in this moment. It is the same emotion many feel when they learn how German officers reacted to American logistics and industrial capacity in World War II, how they marveled at the endless streams of trucks, tanks, and aircraft rolling off the assembly line. But here, the scale is even more dramatic. The technological leap represented by the atomic bomb is so great that Japanese officers could not simply adjust their plans, they had to rethink what war itself meant. American science made a weapon that compressed unimaginable destructive power into a single device, delivered from a single plane, changing the fate of nations overnight. This story also feeds a sense of curiosity. How did the Americans do it? How did a country that just a few years earlier had no atomic program at all manage to harness the power of the atom and deploy it in war before any other nation? The answer lies in an extraordinary combination of scientific talent, industrial resources, and political will, a level of coordination that neither Japan nor the Soviet Union could match during the war. That is why Japanese officers, once the evidence from Hiroshima and Nagasaki became undeniable, felt not just fear, but a kind of astonished respect for the scale of American achievement. And hovering in the background of all of this is the Cold War future. The shock Japan experienced in August 1945 foreshadowed the strategic dilemma that would soon confront the Soviet Union and eventually the entire world. Military planners everywhere had to adjust to a new reality, a reality in which a single aircraft, a single missile, or later a single submarine could deliver enough destructive power to erase a city. For the Soviets, catching up with this American lead became an urgent priority. They would eventually test their own atomic bomb, but always with the knowledge that the United States had been first and that it had demonstrated its capability in the most dramatic way possible. For American audiences, the narrative of Japanese officers struggling to comprehend America's nuclear leap carries a strong emotional charge. There is pride in the brilliance and determination that made such a technological breakthrough possible. There is awe at the sheer scale of the power unleashed. And there is a lingering sense of curiosity about what it must have felt like inside those war rooms in Tokyo, as men raised on samurai legends and conventional battles realized, almost in the same moment, that their strategic world had become obsolete. In the end, the story of Japan's military response to nuclear weapons is the story of a mindset colliding with a new era. It is the story of officers who believed they could manage defeat and negotiate terms, suddenly forced to confront the possibility of total annihilation at the hands of a single weapon they did not fully understand. It is the story of an emperor who chose to end the war rather than see his nation reduced to ashes by a technology that dwarfed anything seen before. And it is the story of how the United States, by unveiling this new weapon, not only ended a world war, but also announced to friend and foe alike, Japan, the Soviet Union, and the rest of the globe, that American technological power had entered a realm that would define the balance of power for decades to come.